And now, our first speaker, Professor Gaurav Desai from the University of Michigan, will speak on deconstructing stereotypes in African literature.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking the National Museum of African Art, the Museum of the American Indian, and the Museum of African American History and Culture for hosting me here in such distinguished company. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and already looking at the time of the hour, I think I'm going to cut down my presentation a bit, so I probably won't take the entire 15 minutes, because I think it'll be good for us to have time for a discussion. But of course, promises. Let's see if I can actually deliver on that. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking a little bit about African literature and stereotypes and how they function in the context of African literature. But you can't have a discussion of stereotypes in African literature without at least beginning by invoking a very famous article by a Kenyan writer, Binyavanga Wainaina, who published it in 2006 in the journal Granta. Let me just read you a quote from there. It's one of the two quotes that frame my discussion. Here he goes. Never have a picture of a well-adjusted African on the cover of your book, or in it, unless that African has won the Nobel Prize. An AK-47, prominent ribs, naked breasts, use these. If you must include an African, make sure you get one in Maasai or Zulu or Dogon dress. In your text, treat Africa as if it were one country. It is hot and dusty with rolling grasslands and huge herds of animals and tall, thin people who are starving. Or it is hot and steamy with very short people who eat primates. Don't get bogged down with precise descriptions. Africa is big, 54 countries, 900 million people who are too busy starving and dying and warring and emigrating to read your book. The continent is full of deserts, jungles, highlands, savannas, and many other things, but your reader doesn't care about all that, so keep your descriptions romantic and evocative and unparticular. Okay, so as you can see, Wainaina has a really sarcastic take on the ways in which Western writers in particular have represented Africa for decades, for centuries in fact. And it's a long article, and it almost lists, catalogs every possible imaginable negative stereotype that you can possibly associate with the African continent. So I'm not actually going to, for the most part in my presentation, dwell on those stereotypes. We all know what those stereotypes are and how problematic they are. I'm going to do something a little different. But before I do that, before I get there, I want to read a quotation from an author who also published an article which was highly debated and discussed, Taye Selassie, who's of Ghanaian and Nigerian descent. And she wrote an article called Bye Bye Barber in 2005, in which she articulated a new vision of thinking about African identity, and particularly in the context of a younger generation of African writers, right? And she's speaking specifically of our own generation of writers, people who oftentimes, not always, not exclusively, grew up as the children of immigrants in the West, in the United States, in England, in other parts of Europe. And she talks about this group of writers as Afropolitans. Now, those of you who have followed this debate, I know will want to jump in and talk about the difficulties with this term, and perhaps we can get into that. But I think it's an important shift that she tries to articulate in terms of what's happening with these younger generation of writers. And she says, what distinguishes this lot and its like in the West and at home is a willingness to complicate Africa, namely to engage with, critique, and celebrate the parts of Africa that mean most to them. Perhaps that what most typifies the Afropolitan consciousness is the refusal to oversimplify, the effort to understand what is ailing in Africa alongside the desire to honor what is wonderful and unique. Rather than essentializing the geographical entity, we seek to comprehend the cultural complexity, to honor the intellectual and spiritual legacy, and to sustain our parents' culture. So you have two different, authors of relatively the same generation. One, emphasizing the continuing legacy of negative stereotypes of Africa, and another one who says, you know what? Let's think about alternative ways of imagining Africa and speaking about Africa. Now, this is something that has been confronted by African writers across generations. You will remember that when Chinua Achebe, many, many years ago, at the beginning of his career, wrote Things Fall Apart, he realized that he had to do two things simultaneously. First, he had to critique what he saw as the racist representation of Africans in British writing, in Joyce Carey in particular, in Conrad. You all know that essay that he wrote on Achebe, on Conrad's racism in Heart of Darkness. And so that was critique. You critique the stereotype that is negative stereotypes. But at the same time, he also realized that he had to provide an alternative vision of Africa, which is what Things Fall Apart was. It was a way of allowing people to imagine a different kind of African space. In fact, if you remember that Things Fall Apart, after having presented this view of Igbo culture, ends up with that kind of note at the end where it's clear, in that ironic note where he talks about the district commissioner and the book that the district commissioner is going to write on the pacification of the primitive tribes of the lower Niger, right? So it incorporates that negative stereotype within the context of the novel. And so, of course, as I say, African writers have had to deal with how Africa gets represented and has been represented for many decades now. But what I think we are beginning to see in this newer 21st century writing is a different kind of conceptualizing of African identities, partly because many of these younger writers, not all of them again, but many of the younger writers have in fact grown up outside of Africa. They have their connections to Africa through their parents, but they don't always necessarily live in Africa. They may visit. Some of them are products of either mixed race or mixed national marriages. So father Ghanaian, mother Nigerian, or a Belgian father and a Nigerian mother, etc. And so they have a very different take on the nationalist aspects of African identities, quite removed or quite different from earlier generations, which for the most part tended to be less heterogeneous, if you will, in terms of their own experiences. And finally, they've also grown up in contexts in which issues of multiculturalism and multiracialism were always on the forefront in their own lives as the children of immigrants. And this shows really interestingly, I think, in some of the novels that we're beginning to see in the 21st century, including Taye Selassie's own novel, which has been much discussed, Ghana Must Go. I don't think I will have much time to talk about the novel itself, but just to give you a sense of, I've been teaching some of these novels in my class at the University of Michigan last semester, and I found that my students really take to them, and part of the reasons why they take to them is because many of the experiences these younger immigrants have are experiences that they may not share identically, but speak to them in a way in which some of the older texts may not speak to them. The popular cultures, stuff that they recognize, the music that's been discussed, the art, etc. But some of the things that I think come to the fore in these texts is an understanding of Africa and Africans multiply located, right? We are now talking about not the immediate post-colonial world of Achebe's Nigeria. We're talking about a world of post-apartheid South Africa and post-apartheid Africa, where you do have to deal with a conception of Africa that is not monoracial. Now, as Achille Mbembe and others have always reminded us, Africa has never been monoracial. There's always been a variety of ethnicities, races, on the continent. But for the most part, during the high moments of colonialism and post-colonialism, the models of nationalism were primarily racially based. And what we're beginning to find now, even in some of these novels, is a questioning of a purely racialized sense of Africa. So for instance, in Nova-Violet Bulawayo's book, We Need New Names, there is, for instance, an episode in which a white Zimbabwean family is being evicted by a corrupt police officer and people who are acting on behalf of the state, and they're being thrown out because they are white. And the white resident says, but I've been here for generations. My parents, I was born here. My father was born here. I'm Zimbabwean. And of course, there's a fight, there's violence, and one of the kids amongst our lead characters begins to cry, and the other kids look at him and say, "Why are you sympathizing with this white family? What's up with you?" And he turns back and he says, "Well, they're people too, they're Zimbabweans too." So it's an interesting kind of moment at which people are rethinking and beginning to think what it means to talk about African identities in multiracial ways. And on the flip side, on the North American side or the European side, what I find interesting in these novels is that, again, for the most part, what used to be a discourse in terms of race and stereotypes, which was a white-black discourse, or a black African-American discourse of bonding, perhaps, or a black diasporic consciousness, or this kind of majoritarian white discourse and stereotyping of Africans, what you're beginning to see now in these novels is different immigrant communities speaking with each other. And this is very much the case in Taya Selassie's novel, because really the discourses of stereotypes are not so much white discourses on Africans or Africans discourses on white society, but in fact Asian American and African American interactions. Again, I don't have, I really wish I had time to go through the actual close readings of that text, because it's a text that really, in some ways, I would argue, is a text that interrogates stereotypes, and some of the conclusions that my students and I draw from this, or the questions that I ask my students to raise, are about the questions of can we actually read against stereotypes? And the second question is, do stereotypes always work in tandem? So in other words, they're not, first of all, they're not always unidirectional. They go in multiple directions, and they don't always fall in step with one another. So just to give you a very quick example, the Asian American professor at MIT in the novel Taya Selassie's Ghana Must Go, who is the father of the fiancé of one of the characters, they have a confrontation, and his reading of Africans, he says, is that, which again, as you'll see, it doesn't go hand in hand with earlier notions of stereotypes, right? He says they're the most brilliant people I've ever seen, and he's a professor, and he says, some of my smartest kids in class are Africans. In fact, Africans are smart, and they're hardworking, and don't let anybody ever tell you anything otherwise. But then, and so of course, the character, the Nigerian, Ghanaian character rather, is pleased to know that negative stereotype of Africans no longer applies, at least in the case of this particular professor. But then he goes on to say, but there's still a problem, and the problem is that they have no moral backbone. And then he goes on to say, talk about family values, and he talks, and what the novel does is, interestingly enough, deals with this whole stereotype and the way in which that issue of family values and morals plays itself out. And in fact, I'm just going to conclude with this, because this is a passage that, so the very quick story you need to know about this is that this is a story of a very well-educated family. Father is a Ghanaian, mother is Nigerian. The father is a very successful doctor, but who is dismissed from his job unfairly. There's an operation he conducts, which he conducts fine, but the patient dies. The patient tries to bring pressure on the hospital to get this guy fired. They fire him because they don't want to be sued. It's a wrongful dismissal, but he cannot win the case. And he's so ashamed after having done so well, after having been the model kind of success story, he's so ashamed of this and he's so humiliated that he can't even really face his family, and he leaves the family, goes back to Ghana because he doesn't even want to admit it almost to his wife and his kids that this is what he's come down to. So that's the backstory. And the son, it's also a story about fathers and son, mothers and daughters, and the son has never quite dealt with the fact that his father has left the family. And so when he hears this Asian American man say, oh, it's all about, you guys don't have a sense of family, your fathers leave you, etc., he's very, very troubled by this, and he has to deal with it throughout the novel. And here's how he ends. He's talking with his fiancée, and he says, your father was right. I didn't go to Haiti. I'll just read this passage, because it's a very moving passage. It's a very troubling passage. My students still don't know quite what to do with it, but it's important, because I think it's an important passage because I think it highlights the tensions between stereotypes and what I call social scripts. To what extent do stereotypes create certain social scripts for people which they try to get out of, but sometimes cannot get out of? And that's something we might want to talk about, right? So here's the passage, okay? I came here to Ghana. You're right. Your father was right. I didn't go to Haiti for that project at graduation. I came here to Ghana to see him. I lied. He kept sending these letters to me to ask me to visit, to come for my birthday, to just hear him out. He'd gotten this place, this ugly apartment. He said it was all he could afford until he could buy land. I don't know. I didn't stay. There was a woman, some other woman he was living with some other woman. I don't know who she was. I know what he was. He was that man. He was that stereotype, the African dad who walks out on his kids, the way that I'd always hoped no one would see us. He squeezes his eyes, shakes his head. And I know, I stand in that house, in that hut he grew up in. The man came from nothing. He struggled. I know. I want to be proud of him, of all he accomplished. I know he accomplished so much, but I can't. I hate him for living in that dirty apartment. I hate him for being that African man. I hate him for hurting my mother, for leaving, for dying. I hate him for dying alone. So, as I say, am I being told that I'm supposed to? Okay, but I probably should stop anyway. But I think, I think that, it's a troubling passage. But I think it deserves a certain amount of close attention, which, of course, I can't give here in the context of some of the other discussions of stereotypes that come up, that get derailed, and then other stereotypes that keep coming back and haunting this narration. But any case, I do hope we'll have some time to talk about some of these things in the context of some of the other presentations as well. Thank you. Sorry.
It's really wonderful to hear a book read aloud and to contemplate close readings.